So I've been talking about the housing bubble in Canada a lot, but so far I haven't talked about any solutions. How do we make housing affordable? There's lots of proposals out there, but rather than just throwing out a handful of ideas, I thought it would be interesting to look at a Canadian city that's actually exploring an aggressive and meaningful strategy on affordable housing, which I've been following for a while now. Calgary, Alberta is currently evaluating recommendations from their Affordable Housing Task Force, and they're going to be voting on it next month. I know most people think of Calgary as just a big bucket of oil with a bunch of money and cows floating in it, but I've looked into it, and it turns out people actually live there. The strategy basically has 6 main ideas, which are broken up into a bunch of smaller action items. The main 6 ideas are: 1. Make it easier to build housing across the city. One of the more controversial items in this section is changing the default residential zoning in the city to allow things like townhouses and row houses everywhere, when most of the city is currently zoned for single detached only. That's right, we're going to be talking about zoning! 2. Make more land available to build housing across the city. This section is mostly about taking unused or underused city land and finding ways to use it for housing, including non-market affordable housing. And non-market affordable housing basically means places that are income tested or places that are available through special programs. 3. Ensure that the supply of affordable housing meets the needs of Indigenous and equity-deserving populations in Calgary. This section is basically geared towards additional support for groups that are overrepresented in unhoused or underhoused populations. 4. Convene the housing sector to facilitate greater collaboration. This section seems a little vague to me, but it's mostly about finding ways to connect different groups in the housing market, like developers, nonprofits, and individuals who need housing. 5. Increase investment to support housing providers. The big one here is property tax exemption for non-market affordable housing owned by nonprofits, and there's also some stuff about asking the provincial and federal governments for more money. And 6. Ensure more individuals have a safe place to call home. This one sounds vague, but there's actually some interesting stuff in here about raising awareness of tenants' rights and more funding for inspections to make sure that landlords are actually keeping the units in good repair. Basically, the idea is to make it easier to build more housing and a greater variety of housing throughout the city, as well as providing significantly more support for non-market affordable housing, which is something the government used to do decades ago, before they started focusing on giving people more access to debt for housing. Fun fact, these recommendations were actually narrowly voted down by the City Council back in June. However, after a massive public outcry, they voted to reconsider 1 day later, and they'll be voting on it again on September 14th. So, not only do we get to look at a bunch of recommendations from actual experts, we also get the drama of a decision coming up in 5 weeks. Over the next month or so, I'm going to make more videos breaking down the individual ideas in the strategy and how they apply in the context of Calgary, as well as Canada as a whole. Personally, I'm not really holding my breath for a bunch of politicians to solve the problems of ordinary people, but I do think there's an opportunity here for Calgary to adopt a housing strategy that puts housing people as the priority, rather than just treating housing as another financial asset. I'm putting a link to the task force's recommendations in my bio in case you want to read the whole thing for yourself. And you really should, especially if you live in Calgary, because the housing crisis is an issue of local and national importance, and you shouldn't just take the word of some guy on TikTok about it. The more you educate yourself on these issues, the more effectively you'll be able to advocate for yourself and for others. Read up for yourself, talk to people, and decide what makes sense to you. Calgary, Alberta is trying to make housing more affordable, and I'm going to explain how. In this video, I'm going to be talking about a part of Calgary's affordable housing plan that deals with one of my favorite subjects, zoning! This is mostly geared towards building more housing in what's known as the missing middle, which is basically medium-density housing. By the way, there was a good article by Jimmy Thompson on the Narwhal last month that discusses this issue in the context of Victoria, BC if you want to read more. So, in most Canadian cities, instead of having a healthy mix of housing types of different densities, we tend to have small pockets where very dense housing, like apartment buildings, are allowed, and then vast areas of land where you're only allowed to build single detached houses. In 2022, a group called School of Cities produced maps showing the yellow belt regions of different Canadian cities, meaning the parts of the cities that are zoned for single detached houses, which are normally shown in yellow on zoning maps. Calgary, which has a significant issue with urban sprawl, has 62.3% of the city zoned for single detached homes. Toronto was 54.3%, although they've recently voted to allow multiplexes throughout the city. Vancouver, where prices are probably the most insane, has 63.8% of the city zoned for single detached housing, despite having a higher population and a smaller footprint than Calgary. Edmonton, on the other hand, only has 20.7% zoned for single detached, and that's mostly at the very outskirts of the city. One of the proposals to address this is by changing the default residential zoning in the city to RCG, which means they'd allow detached houses but also duplexes, townhouses, and row houses, as well as secondary suites and backyard suites. Also, within a few hundred meters of major transit corridors, they want to implement something called HGO zoning, which is a little more flexible than RCG, but it's still geared towards housing with ground-level entrances to each unit. Basically, by changing the default residential zone in the city, Calgary is proposing to eliminate the yellow belt entirely and allow denser housing everywhere. I like this for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, is that it makes it easier to build more housing in neighborhoods where more people want to live. Right now, when an area becomes more desirable to live, the only thing developers can really do is build detached infill housing, which, in my opinion, is one of the worst things for housing affordability in a city. Detached infill is where they buy up smaller houses in residential neighborhoods, then rebuild them into the largest and most luxurious home that they can fit onto the lot. You end up seeing things like this, where you have gigantic new build homes packed together right next to smaller, older homes. This rarely does anything to provide more housing in the area, but it does make the property itself much more expensive. Sometimes one lot does get divided into two, which is the case in the image here, but they took a property that cost less than $500,000 and rebuilt it into 2 homes that cost more than $1 million each. This is one of the biggest barriers of entry into housing for young people these days. Developers aren't building small homes anymore the way they used to in the 60s and 70s. Because the land and permitting are so expensive these days, they maximize profits by building the largest houses they possibly can, which drives up prices. Affordable new build detached homes just aren't viable anymore in a lot of places, but the majority of our cities are designed to allow only that and nothing else. Instead, by allowing developers to put up denser housing, they'd be able to create a larger number of less expensive units, which could be sold more quickly and easily than these gigantic luxury homes. The second reason I like it is that it removes the incentive for land speculators to sit on empty or underused buildings in the hope that developers will eventually pay them a huge premium. In pretty much every comparison video I make, people come to the comments saying that the only reason the rundown house is expensive is because it's zoned for something like townhouses or duplex housing and it's being sold as a development opportunity, which is true, but it's also part of what I'm criticizing. By changing the default zoning, they would eliminate the zoning lottery that pays out to lucky landowners who can then sit on their property until someone is willing to pay whatever ridiculous price they're asking, and it would put everyone on an equal footing, which would make the land market for development a lot more competitive. Instead of having to pay a huge amount to one person holding out for a better price, they can just move one block over and negotiate with someone else because everyone who owns property would have the same opportunity. So the default rezoning is the major change, but there's also a few other recommendations that encourage greater density as well. They want to remove minimum parking requirements in residential areas, create an incentive program for people building secondary suites, simplify the approvals process for dwelling units, and one more interesting one, incorporate all types of neighborhood urban form categories into each local area plan. I looked up this terminology and it's kind of specific to Calgary city planning, but basically the idea is that they want planning to automatically include a variety of land uses instead of just having massive areas of just houses and nothing else, which you see a lot in the GTA. For example, this is an area in Milton, which is about 30 or 40 kilometers west of Toronto, and you can see there's not really much there other than single detached houses. Of course, this stuff is all geared towards market housing, and a lot of people on the first video mentioned social housing or non-market affordable housing. The good news is there's a lot of recommendations in the plan on that as well, which I'm going to get into in the next video. Again, if you want to read the plan for yourself, check the link in my bio, and if you live in Calgary, definitely try to learn more about this. If you have an opinion on it, send a message to your councillor before the vote on September 14th. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time! Calgary, Alberta is trying to make housing more affordable, and I'm going to explain how. This is part of a series, so check the playlist if you want more background. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the thing everyone seems to want to hear about, which is non-market affordable housing. You could also call it social housing or low-income housing, but however you want to call it, it means the same thing, which is housing that's built specifically to be accessible to lower-income people, rather than just building more housing. The big thing here, in my opinion, is a proposal to take unused or underused city land and lease it at heavily subsidized or zero rates for affordable housing. I've actually talked about this before with Dean Tester from Make Housing Affordable Ottawa, because he's been pitching the same idea there. The usual approach for new housing development is for the city to sell land to developers at a profit to the city and let developers build it out more or less how they want to. Instead, they're proposing to have the city maintain ownership of the land but lease it out to the private sector or nonprofits to build affordable housing as defined by the city and have qualified partners manage it for at least a 40-year commitment. This allows the city to provide a significant subsidy in terms of land cost without having to directly spend very much money. This also ties in with the removal of parking minimums that I talked about in the last video, because Calgary has a large amount of underused surface-level parking lots, particularly close to transit, which is where you'd want affordable housing to be located anyway. This is the entrance to another light rail station, and it's surrounded by a huge amount of empty land, because the city sold it off to a private developer in 2016 instead of holding it for housing, so there's a lot of prime space here just going to waste. Next, they want to make buildings owned by nonprofits that are providing non-market affordable housing exempt from municipal property taxes, and lobby the provincial government to exempt them from the provincial portion as well. This is basically another subsidy, but it's qualified in a way that means the money can't just be taken back and paid out to shareholders. This also means that existing nonprofits that are already successfully doing this would free up more money in their budget for improving their existing properties or building new ones. On top of that, they want to lobby the provincial government to change the Municipal Government Act so they can exempt affordable housing from certain planning requirements like public hearings, which would speed up approvals and increase certainty for affordable housing projects. This is a really important one because it's a constant battle to get anything built when it's always being obstructed by people who expect that their neighborhood will never change ever. For example, there's a 59-unit supportive housing project in the Willowdale neighborhood of Toronto that was funded by the federal government and approved by City Council, and it was designed using modular housing units for rapid construction because the need was considered so urgent. That was 2 years ago, and they still haven't broken ground on the project because of opposition by the neighbors. One of their biggest delay tactics was filing an appeal with the Ontario Land Tribunal, which they know is going to fail, but they've repeatedly rescheduled the meeting as a delay tactic. For reference, the appeal was allowed almost a year ago, and the meeting still hasn't happened. Now that might sound bad, but here's the kicker. Because this was supposed to be an expedited project, those modular housing units have already been ordered and delivered, so now they're paying $77,000 a month for storage while they try to sort out this red tape. That's over $900,000 a year that's being spent not to build this housing, and based on the current meeting date, they're probably not going to be able to lay the foundation before winter hits this year. By the way, if you want to know more about that Willowdale development, check out this guy Baby Luke, who's been doing a number of videos about it. So basically, they're making it cheaper and easier to build affordable housing on 3 major fronts: land cost, taxes, and permitting. Between those 3 things, they're putting together a solid business case for building lower-cost housing and maintaining it over the long term, instead of just putting up luxury condo towers and selling them as fast as possible. There's a couple other things in the recommendations I want to talk about in this video. One, a statement about enabling a minimum of 15% of housing units to be non-market affordable housing in every local area plan so they can be distributed across the city. This seems to me like it's already covered under a lot of the other zoning and planning items, but my guess is this was originally going to be an inclusionary zoning measure where they would require developers to make a certain number of the units in new developments non-market affordable housing. However, that would have been made moot back in December when Alberta's provincial government removed the ability for cities to implement inclusionary zoning after a successful lobbying effort by a builder and developer industry association. So rather than take it out entirely, they just reworded it to be a little less firm. At least that's my guess. The other one is adding co-op housing, co-housing, and other alternative housing forms that involve cooperative living to the city's non-market affordable housing plans. Basically, they're saying that affordable housing can look a lot of different ways and they should support all of them. So last time I talked about the plans to build more market housing, but there's also a whole lot in there about non-market housing as well, and this is something I really like about this set of recommendations. Normally, when governments talk about big issues like this, they just pick whatever root cause is most politically convenient to them. Then they hold a press conference where they pat themselves on the back for coming up with a really narrow and ineffectual plan to address it, and they usually fail at even doing that. Instead, the Calgary Task Force's plan treats housing on affordability as an issue with many causes that requires many solutions that all need to be implemented at the same time. So if you haven't already, check out the playlist and watch parts 1 and 2, and go read the affordable housing recommendations for yourself. And if you live in Calgary and have an opinion on this, contact your councillor about it before the vote on September 14th. Remember, the original vote on this was 7-8, so Calgary only needs to flip one councillor for the plan to pass. This is a political situation where your voice could actually make a difference. Now, I think these first 3 parts of the series cover most of the major stuff in the plan, but there's also more recommendations about advocacy and funding streams that I haven't really gotten into yet. So expect at least a couple more videos in this series before the vote next month, and if this interests you, go research what groups are advocating for affordable housing in your area and get up to speed on your own local politics. Calgary, Alberta is going to be voting on their affordable housing plan on September 14th, and I'm going to talk about how the vote failed the first time and what could be different this time around, including our first spreadsheet of this series. As I mentioned in part 1, the plan was originally voted down by Calgary City Council on June 6th in a 7-8 vote. However, followed by an immediate public outcry, they voted 14-1 to reconsider the plan and vote again on September 14th, with the only dissenting voice being Ward 4 Councillor Sean Chu. So, with only one councillor needing to change their vote, and with so many of them voting to reconsider, it does seem like there's a good chance that the plan can pass later this month. But the question is, who's most likely to flip? Obviously, this probably depends on the individual personalities of the councillors, but they were also voted in by the people of their wards and rely on them for re-election. So the question is, can we find any common factors in the wards that voted yes versus the ones that voted no, and can we use that to provide any insight? Fortunately, Calgary has really detailed demographic information on each ward available on the city website. The data is from 2016, so it's somewhat out of date, but it'll help to give us an overall feel for each ward. So, I took a variety of stats for each ward, I put them into a spreadsheet, and I made a weighted average of the demographics between wards that voted for the plan versus wards that voted against the plan, and found a few interesting results. On average, the wards where the councillors voted against the plan had a higher median income, a lower number of people paying more than 30% of their income for housing, and less people considered to be low income by the city's definition. They also tended to be older, with fewer visible minorities, and a greater proportion of single detached homes. There's some pretty obvious trends here, so I took all the ward statistics, converted them to deviations from the city average, then ran a logistic regression to see if I could figure out which wards were the closest to the middle of voting yes or no. This isn't a very rigorous analysis, particularly because it's only 14 data points, but let's just go ahead with it anyway. This is a chart of the estimated vote for each ward based on demographics, with 0 being no and 1 being yes. Based on this analysis, the one who seems closest to flipping is Terry Wong of Ward 7, who has actually already put up a page asking constituents for feedback on the plan and the second vote. Ward 7 has more lower-income people who are struggling with the cost of housing, fewer detached homes, and a lower median income than the city average, so it's safe to assume that a lot of voters in that ward are concerned about housing affordability. By the way, if you live in Ward 7 and want to submit feedback to the councillor directly, the deadline is Thursday, September 7th. Apart from that, we've got Dan McLean of Ward 13, Sonia Sharp of Ward 1, and Sean Chu of Ward 4, although given that he was the only person to vote against reconsidering the vote, it's pretty safe to bet that he'll vote no again. Another interesting person in the mix is Andre Chabot of Ward 10, which has a lower median income than the city overall, as well as more people struggling with the cost of housing. He also previously ran to be a federal candidate for the Conservative Party of Canada, who are now pushing the housing crisis as an election issue, so it's possible there will be more pressure on him to vote in favor of the affordable housing plan than some of the other councillors. Now, in contrast to what I've just said, I talked to a friend in Calgary who's more in the loop on this vote, and he mentioned that Richard Pootmans is one of the people considered a possible swing voter, even though he ranked lowest in my calculations. So take my analysis with a grain of salt, and don't let it discourage you from getting involved. So, as usual, if you're interested in this, check my bio and read Calgary's affordable housing plan for yourself. If you live in Calgary and you've got an opinion on it, send a message to your councillor as soon as possible. Even if you don't think it's likely that your councillor will flip, it's still a good idea to make your voice heard. That's all for today, so thanks for watching, and stay tuned for next time when I'll be talking about some of the tenant protections proposed in the affordable housing plan. Calgary City Council is going to be voting on their affordable housing plan in just a couple of days. I've been doing a series of videos outlining their plan and wanted to do one last one before the vote to cover support and protection for tenants outlined in the plan. First, they want to develop and implement a tenant support service similar to what already exists in Edmonton. This is basically a program that provides education and basic services for tenants such as free courses and specific advice regarding the Residential Tenancies Act. They also provide mediation with landlords, assistance with the provincial rental tribunal process, and referrals to other support services. Basically, it's a service to ensure that people are fully aware of their rights as tenants and can protect themselves against illegal actions by landlords. The second item is collaborating with existing programs and providing seed funding for new programs to help keep people housed. There's obviously a ton of options here, but the two specific examples they mention are investing seed money in community programs that help individuals with first and last month's rent obligations, and providing funding for community programs that help prevent people who are already housed from losing their housing, like landlord mediation services and support for rental arrears. There's a couple more things to talk about here, but keep in mind that Calgary is a municipality and they have a limited amount of jurisdiction on what they can actually do. So these next items I'm going to talk about are more geared towards lobbying the provincial government for policy changes that the city is unable to implement themselves. It would be up to the government of Alberta to actually implement them, so take that for what it's worth. The first item is, the city would investigate rent control models used in other jurisdictions and compile a report to be presented to the provincial government. Alberta currently has no rent control other than a requirement that rent can only be raised every 12 months with at least 3 months' notice. However, landlords can raise the rent as much as they want. There's no limit on the annual increase. Over the last year alone, the average rent in Calgary has increased 21.6% for a one-bedroom or 17.4% for a two-bedroom, although there have been individual cases where the annual increase has been as much as 40%. The other item is basically a list of things to lobby the province for that would protect tenants and ensure rental units are up to standard, including increasing the number of public health inspectors so that unit inspections can be completed within a week, revising the Residential Tenancies Act to protect tenants from unfounded evictions if a complaint is made to Alberta Health Services or another public agency, providing financial supports for tenants who are unable to find or afford alternative accommodations while rental properties are being repaired from unsafe or inadequate conditions, review and enhance the minimum health and housing standards to ensure that tenants are protected from substandard housing, and create an office for a housing official serving tenants and landlords in Calgary to investigate and resolve complaints around things like discrimination, mistreatment, and substandard housing. This is probably the last video I'll have time to make on this subject before September 14th, so the next video is probably going to be on the outcome of the vote. But someone did send me 600 pages of consultations submitted by members of the public, so I'm sure they'll provide some good material for my Letters from NIMBY series. As usual, if you want to read the plan for yourself, check my bio, where I'll keep it linked until after the vote. To everyone in Calgary waiting on the decision, good luck with the vote this week. And to Calgary City Council, don't fuck this one up.